She didn't scream, she didn't accuse, she didn't even ask, "Why don't you love me anymore?" She just went silent. No slammed door, no cold goodbye, only a soft withdrawal, like the warmth leaving a cup of coffee that was once shared. Every morning, and he didn't notice it right away, not until the silence grew so loud it echoed in the space where her voice used to live. The most dangerous moment in a relationship is not when she yells, it's when she stops trying to be heard, because when a woman falls silent, that's when a man, slowly, quietly, begins to fall apart. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And for him, her silence became fate. You know, for men like us, after 50, after decades of trying to do the right thing, this kind of loss doesn't always come with a loud bang. Sometimes it comes with silence. You're still married. She's still making dinner. The bills are still paid. But one night as you sit down at the table, you realize something's shifted. She used to greet you at the door. Now she barely glances up. She used to laugh at your dry humor. Now even your best stories fall flat. She used to reach for your hand under the covers. Now there's just space. You didn't cheat, you didn't shout, you didn't walk away. You were just busy, responsible, quiet. You thought this is what a good man does. But as you sit across from her, the silence stretches, not the peaceful kind, the kind that carries weight, resentment, distance, and in that moment, it hits you. She's still in the house, but she left a long time ago. No packed bags, no dramatic goodbye, just the quiet kind of leaving, the kind that unravels a man from the inside out. His name was Robert. He was 58 when she stopped speaking. They'd been married 32 years, raised 2 kids, bought a house, lived through layoffs, funerals, surgeries. He thought they'd made it through the worst of it. Robert was the kind of man who handled things quietly, without drama. He fixed broken gutters, took care of taxes, never forgot to take the trash out on Thursday. He didn't cheat, didn't drink. He wasn't cruel or careless. He believed deep down that was enough. But then she stopped asking if he wanted coffee. She stopped leaving. Sticky notes on the fridge. She stopped finishing her stories when he entered the room. At first, he thought she was tired, maybe going through something personal. He gave her space. Thought he was being respectful. After all, men like Robert were. Taught that love meant leaving her alone when she's upset. But weeks passed, then months, and slowly the house got quieter. She still made dinner, still folded his shirts, still sat next to him on the couch. But there was no warmth in her voice, no sparkle in her eyes. It was like living with a ghost. One night, he woke up, around 2 a.m. The bed beside him was empty. He walked into the kitchen and saw her sitting at the table in the dark, staring at nothing. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. He just stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do with the moment. It wasn't until the next morning that he realized that wasn't the first time she'd sat in that darkness. It was just the first time he noticed. That day, something inside Robert began to shift. He started remembering little things, how she used to hum while washing dishes, how she'd rub his shoulder when he came home from work, how she used to cry quietly in the bathroom at night, and how he'd pretend not to hear. The silence wasn't sudden. It was built brick, by every moment he chose comfort over connection. Every time he said, "I'm fine," instead of "I'm tired and scared. Every time he gave her space, when what she needed was presence. He tried to bring her back in his own way, started talking more, asked if she wanted to take a walk, offered to make coffee. But it felt like trying to reach someone on the other side of a glass wall. She'd become still, unreachable, not angry, not cruel, just absent. And that's what broke him, because Robert realized she hadn't left because she hated him. She hadn't even left the house. She had just withdrawn from the version of herself that kept waiting for him to show up emotionally. And when she finally stopped waiting, she stopped speaking. She didn't slam the door. She didn't say goodbye. She just went silent. And that silence, it said everything he never had the courage to ask. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When she went silent, Robert didn't just lose her words, he lost the mirror she used to hold up for him. You see, in Jungian psychology, every man carries within him a feminine image, his anima. She's not his wife, his lover, or any real woman. She's a symbol, a projection, a reflection of his own emotional life. In the early years of their marriage, Robert projected his anima onto her. He saw her not as she truly was, but as he needed her to be. Soft, nurturing, understanding. The emotional center he himself had, never learned to build within. But as years passed and life wore on, he stopped tending to her presence, not just physically, but soulfully. And when a man refuses to integrate his inner feminine, when he treats vulnerability as weakness, when he silences his own emotional needs, he starts demanding that the woman in front of him carry all that weight. She becomes the emotional processor, the peacemaker, the one who always feels. But no woman can hold that projection forever. Eventually she tires. She disconnects. She withdraws, not in rage, but in quiet reclamation. Robert thought she had changed, but in truth, she had stopped performing the illusion he created. That's why her silence was so devastating. It wasn't just her absence he felt. It was the collapse of the fantasy he had built around her, and this collapse triggered something even deeper inside him, his shadow. The shadow, in Jung's terms, is everything we reject about ourselves, our fears, our neediness, our helplessness, our emotional hunger. When she was silent, there was no longer anyone to absorb his noise, no one to regulate the emotional temperature of the relationship, no one to soothe him without him having to ask. And in that silence, he was finally left alone with his own unmet needs, with the parts of him he had spent decades suppressing. It felt like abandonment, but it was revelation, because the truth is, what broke him was never her silence. What broke him was the voice. Inside that silence, the voice of the boy who never learned how to feel without shame, the man who never learned how to sit in pain without trying to fix it. He looked at her, sitting in quiet. But what he really saw was himself, unprepared, unrooted, unfinished. Her silence became a symbolic rupture, a psychic wake-up call, a moment when the unconscious burst through the seams of daily routine. And that's what Jung meant by fate. It's not punishment. It's pattern. And until we face it, we'll keep thinking life just happens to us, when really it's us who have been asleep the whole time. She didn't leave to hurt him. She went silent to become herself again, and in doing so, she unknowingly handed him the very thing he avoided all his life, a confrontation with his own soul. The part that shook him most wasn't the shouting. It wasn't slammed doors, ultimatums, or a suitcase by the door. It was her quiet. She didn't demand explanations, didn't accuse him of not loving her anymore, didn't beg him to talk or to feel or to come back emotionally. She simply stopped trying. That's what undid him, not her leaving, but her surrender. Robert had always been a man of reaction. He could handle anger. He could survive silence, short-term silence. He knew how to wait out tension. He was skilled at doing just enough to keep things from falling apart, fix the sink, mow the lawn, nod at the right time. He believed that was care, that was love. But now there was no tension to wait out, no surface anger to manage, no emotional storm to ride through. Instead, there was a stillness that unsettled everything. It was a quiet that didn't feel temporary. It felt settled, certain. Like something deep had shifted inside her, and there was no going back. She no longer reminded him to open up. She no longer asked, "How was your day?" She no longer searched his eyes for connection. And it wasn't that she had grown cold. No, she had grown full of her own realization. She realized she had been trying alone for far too long, and when she let go of the rope, he realized he was never pulling his weight. The collapse didn't come with shouting matches. It came with moments that once seemed ordinary. Dinner served but barely touched. Coffee made but left to go cold. An exhale she let out when he walked. In not relief but resignation, he had mistaken her sighs for contentment, when they were really little funerals of hope, one after another. As he moved through the house now, everything looked the same, but nothing felt familiar. Every room carried the imprint of her absence, even while she was still physically there. He began to see how much he had needed her presence to feel alive, not because she cooked or cleaned or made the bed, but because her emotional warmth gave his life a tether, a sense that someone still saw him, still felt him. When she stopped engaging, even in frustration, something in him cracked, all the old defense lines. She's just too sensitive. She's always asking for too much. She doesn't appreciate how hard I work. They fell flat, because now there was no one on the other side to push back. No more arguments, no more corrections, just silence. And in that silence, he could hear the echoes of every moment he had avoided showing up. And that's when the real pain began. Not the pain of losing her, but the pain of seeing himself. Unfiltered, unmasked, unloved, not by her, but by his own emotional absence, because losing someone in anger still gives you something to fight against, but losing them in stillness, that leaves you alone with your reflection. And for a man who's avoided looking at that mirror for decades, who's feared his own depth more than any confrontation, that's the most excruciating truth of all. She didn't punish him. She freed herself, and in doing so, she left him to face the one person he never truly met, himself. This was never about revenge. She didn't go silent to hurt him. She didn't walk away to make a point. She didn't withdraw as a weapon. She simply stopped performing. For years, she had carried the emotional weight of their connection. She tried to be what he needed. The calm when he was overwhelmed, the warmth when he was distant, the softness when he turned cold. But somewhere along the way, she realized, she wasn't living her life. She was surviving inside his projection. Carl Jung called this the anima projection, when a man unconsciously assigns his inner feminine onto a woman. He sees her not as she is, but as a mirror of everything he cannot access within himself. And what happens when she stops reflecting that illusion? He feels abandoned, but in truth, it's the illusion that collapses, not the woman. She hadn't left him. She had left the version of herself that existed only in his mind, because she wasn't just his comfort. She wasn't just the one who got him when no one else did. She was a full human being, with her own longings, her own pain, her own inner world that had nothing to do with him, and when she stopped trying to live up to the version of her he needed, he was left with someone unfamiliar, someone real. That's the irony most men don't see until it's too late. The woman they say changed is often the woman who finally became herself. And in that becoming, she had to let go of being the emotional caretaker of his wounds. She had to stop softening her truth to protect his ego. She had to stop dimming her voice to make space for his silence. This was never about leaving him. It was about returning to herself, and once she did, he started asking questions he never had the courage to face. Did I ever really see her? Or did I only see the version of her that made me feel safe? Did I love her? Or did I love how she loved me? That's when the mirror turned, because her silence wasn't a wall, it was a mirror. And in that mirror, he saw the ghost of the man he had become, a man who was needed, but never known, a man who was respected, but rarely received, a man who had built an identity around doing, but never learned how to be. Jung believed that true transformation only begins when we reclaim the projections we place on others, when we stop expecting someone else to hold our brokenness and start facing it ourselves. And so in the stillness she left behind, He didn't just lose her presence, he lost the illusion, and in that loss, he had his first chance at truth. Not to win her back, not to return to how things were, but to finally meet the man he had abandoned long before she ever did. Maybe you've lived through this. Maybe you've been on the receiving end of that silence, not because she stopped loving you, but because she started loving herself. Or maybe you've been the one who went silent, not to punish, not to manipulate, but because the noise of trying, explaining, proving became louder than your own peace. If so, you're not alone. This isn't just a story about one man and one woman. It's about all of us. The ways we lose each other, not in shouting matches, but in soft exits, in quiet disappearances, and sometimes the silence we dread most is the one that sets us free. So let me ask you, have you ever gone silent not out of hate, but out of healing? Have you ever stopped speaking not because you didn't care, but because you finally started to? If that speaks to you, leave a comment below. Just write, "Her silence saved me," or "I've been him," and let someone out there feel a little less alone tonight. Because as Carl Jung once said, true strength isn't in holding on, it's in letting go, with presence, with clarity, with soul.